Hello. It's been some time since the Iran war began. I think by now it's clear that the war was imposed by Israel and the US on Iran and not the other way around. I think that this is echoed in most media out there. The conflict centers around the Straits of Hormuz, and the other day, I think, or rather throughout the conflict, Trump has been talking about how uh, we don't really even need the Strait of Hormuz. It started with the fact that Iran better open the Strait of Hormuz, and then NATO better send ships, Japan and Korea better send ships to help the US, transitioning to, hey, we don't even need the Strait of Hormuz. We get barely a few percentage of our gas, of our petroleum from the Strait of Hormuz. But I really don't buy it. I think in the end, a lot of US GDP growth is based on AI compute, based on the expansion of AI compute. I think that the US needs energy and that the rising energy prices seriously jeopardizes US growth. I think that that can't be gainsaid. Well, right now you have JD Vance coming back from Islamabad saying there's no deal. So what, we're just going to go right back to war? I mean, right now, this 2 week ceasefire is seems like it's on its last legs, or rather, it seems to be a very fragile peace. Israel hasn't stopped their bombing of Lebanon, and there's a big doubt, there's a big question mark as to whether they're even going to go to the ceasefire table, to the negotiation table with the Lebanese government. And with no deal reached on the key points of nuclear enrichment and opening the Straits of Hormuz, I can't see very many ways for this war to come to a close immediately. Maybe the ceasefire talks drag on for a bit. Maybe Trump gets back to bombing a little bit here, a little bit there, but maybe not right now. Although this is all subject, he could just change his mind tomorrow. It's subject to how Trump sees this whole diplomacy thing. Maybe he sees it as less damaging or costly than bombs today, and tomorrow he gets right back to bombing. I mean, his Secretary of Defense, self-styled Secretary of War, likes to negotiate with bombs after all. This guy, Pete Hegseth, real warmonger. At this point, it's clear for anyone watching from outside the United States at least that the US military industrial complex and its links to Congress is a kind of amoeba that feeds on the projection of military might throughout the world. This military industrial complex feeds on this projection, this war that happens overseas, and the US Democratic leaders just digest all the information and spew all sorts of stuff out on the population to manipulate them, right? In the modern world, Trump has basically went around mainstream media sources and gone right to using True Social to prosecute this conflict. There was a recent article, a recent blog post that's been going viral on X lately. The headline reads, "How many years has the US been at war?" And the list just goes on and on since 1776. On and on and on and on. And at the end, it says here that since the United States was founded in 1776, she has been at war for 229 out of 246 years, or 93% of the time. Maybe you can question whether one or other of these wars are properly so-called wars. But the point being made here is very compelling. It does seem plausible that the US just feeds on this projection of war, even beyond the recency bias introduced by the Iran war. Point basically is that the United States poses the gravest threat to international peace. In Vietnam, as in Afghanistan, as in Iraq. But how can it be possible? The US is a democracy, isn't it? That's what I keep hearing people say. Yes, there's this sense that democracies are somehow naturally more peaceful, but I doubt it, I really do. The US likes to point to authoritarian systems like China and Russia, and more recently, the Iranian regime, raising time-worn examples of internal repression and large-scale political killings from the 30,000 that has increased to 40,000 and more recently 45,000 as per Trump. But then they usually leave out all the death and destruction caused by the US wars overseas, the US many wars overseas. You see this justified, this war justified time and again by simple moralistic language, good against evil. And of course, its modern secularized cousin is the free world against terrorists. The Americans will call it whataboutism, the whataboutism fallacy, if you raise all of US wars as a counterpoint to the internal repression supposedly effected by so-called authoritarian countries. But then in the same sentence, they'll ask again, what about China? What about Russia? What about the Iranian regime? When you suggest the US has prosecuted violence on a comparable or greater scale. Now, I'm not in support of authoritarianism, not at all. But the idea that the US has contributed to world peace for its own sake because the US is somehow morally good, this idea is just laughable. At the most, the US was a hegemonic backstopping of a world order created for the enrichment of American oligarchs. A hegemonic backstopping that is gradually going away with the Trump administration's many missteps. Is it any surprise? Maybe some are surprised because the idea is that the common man in a democratic system who has a voice in this system would oppose such violence, and that this is to be contrasted with, say, the Chinese system where the common man on the street has no voice at all. But really, those familiar with my work will know that democracies, in my view, are essentially instruments for diffusing responsibility. So, as for myself, I'm not very surprised. Leaders use democratic mandate. The democratic leaders of the United States use their democratic mandate as a justification for their policies, just as much as they are limited by it sometimes. It all depends on the leader, and US presidents are generally quite capable at steering their population to whatever decision it deems fit, by virtue of essentially plutocratic lobbies. You see the blockade on the United States, on the Straits of Hormuz, sorry, initiated by the United States. This was just 2 days ago. Blockading any and all ships trying to enter or leave the Straits of Hormuz. So no in, no out, no passage to countries who have paid an illegal toll to Iran, etc., etc. So this is another extreme position I think we can expect will be modified, tweaked, or walked back in the coming days. You know, Trump always chickens out. But let me say something finally about the Singaporean Foreign Minister Vivian Balakrishnan's reason for not engaging in negotiations with the Iranian Foreign Minister. If I can pull this up here. Singapore will not negotiate for safe passage to the Straits of Hormuz. He raised in a speech, I believe, that the Straits of Singapore is far more important to global trade than the Straits of Hormuz by volume of container trade, and also that the narrowest point of the Straits of Singapore is 2 nautical miles as opposed to Hormuz's 21 nautical miles. Then says engaging in negotiations for a free passage of ships through Hormuz erodes the legal principle that such free passage in international waters is a right, not a privilege. And this is important for Singapore to support because if they negotiate with Hormuz over the Strait, if they negotiate with Iran over the Straits of Hormuz, then they have to negotiate with other countries over passage through the Straits of Singapore. I think that's how the logic is going. It's a ridiculous position, ridiculous and absurd. Where does this right come from? International law, the same international law backstopped by American power. Tell me where the power for enforcing this international law comes from. This right codified in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which I would add the US is not even a party to. This right, this legal principle, if it is a legal principle, I think has to be fairly and impartially applied. Otherwise, it's nothing more than a moral principle. Tell me where the power comes from, and maybe you'll be clear as to whether this international legal principle exists in fact. No matter how many articles and BS conmen might try to sneak in, at the end, this thing called international law is backstopped by the might of countries. And in this case, backstopped by the might of one country amongst many, a country who functions on the basis of self-interest only, of America first, or more accurately, America's wealthy first. And I think this international law, in this light, taken in this light, is a joke. Why use it as a basis to guide the decision whether to negotiate or not? If I can put it another way, diplomacy is better engaged on the basis that bilateral ties conduce to mutual benefit far better than international law. International law is no kind of law, but rather a collection of rules into which are smuggled all kinds of partial interests. International law is good for rhetoric and political persuasion and political organization, but rarely for anything remotely related to justice.